Welcome to this week's edition of Good Books Radio. Audiobooks.com is the chief underwriter for Good Books Radio, which is produced by UTRGV Media Services for Rio Grande Valley Public Radio. And now, here's your host, Dr. John Cook.
Welcome once again to another edition of Good Books Radio. I'm your host this week, Dr. John Cook, and with me today we have a very special program because we have three authors on tap for today, and they're all sitting here with me in the studio. They're distinguished gentlemen with careers associated with the university with which I work. We'll talk to each of them a bit about the books that they have brought to the show and then say a little bit more about what they're going to do going forward. I'm going to start with Mr. Michael Putegnat, who is a gold medalist of the IPPY Award, and he's written a novel called The Settling. Now, I didn't get to all of it, but I did find it engaging from the very opening. First of all, we find a skeleton in an old World War II battlefield in Belgium. Mm-hmm. And then we move to Tom Campbell, who's a professor at a little noted nor highly respected university, worried about the end of the semester because that's when all the kids come in with their late papers and their excuses because they don't have tests, and sort of get a feel for what kind of attitude he has. He's just lost his father at a very late age, and he has a friend named Ellie who looks after him from time to time. And then there's this guy, Bob Vardis, who is in charge of medals and honors in the Pentagon and makes sure that people don't get awards they don't deserve, and is very good Sherlock Holmes on that. How does this all come together?
Well, when I get asked what is this book is about, which is always a fair question, and I think other authors have the same problem. You pause and think, well, it took 240 or 300 pages to write it. It's kind of hard to answer. But the truth is, there is a kind of a theme working, and I kind of capture it in the title as best as I could. The Settling. Essentially, this is about the choices we make in life, and this is the story of five people who each, like us, are struggling to settle unfinished business in their own lives. Mm-hmm. And the event that you refer to, the finding of this, the remains of this World War II soldier in the Hurtgen Forest, is the convening event. And it's almost the accidental convening event. When you think about the word settling, it actually has 30 different uses.
Is that right?
And when you think about all the ways it is used, it's kind of daunting. But frankly, it comes down to three kinds of meanings. One is when we think of settling down, and to come to a rest, both figuratively and literally, like in a place. Settling as kind of like the final coming to a resolution of a debt, a dispute, or a question. And then there's this more modern use, which is settling for, where we accept a suboptimal choice, mm-hmm. and all the consequences that come with it. And essentially, this story, while set in the present, and explores all of these through the lives of these five characters. Mm-hmm. It's written in a mystery suspense genre, which leads the reader through a series of discoveries that in the end get revealed in a denouement, and where the whole truth is essentially revealed. And then I'm borrowing on a lot of predecessors in that genre that I've loved and respected, Conan Doyle and Sherlock Holmes, which, as you made the point, I make an analog with him with Vardis. Mm-hmm. And even though it is essentially following that genre form, mm-hmm. it really is intended to talk about how in each of our lives we do all those forms of settling, and how these characters are dealing with that, and how it comes to hopefully a satisfying ending for them.
Mm-hmm. Now, Tom Campbell's father, Charlie, was a simple man, didn't make much money, lived a simple life in a humble home. And after his passing, Tom didn't much care to keep anything around.
Tom was one of those guys that was smarter than his parents, mm-hmm. and they he grows up in Woodville, Texas. He's the valedictorian of the class, mm-hmm. and gets a scholarship to Brown. So he goes and sees this whole new world, and it builds in him, interestingly, a kind of resentment for his father, who was a small town bookkeeper, very quiet, very reclusive. who was an orphan who grew up in Maryland, and ends up coming to Woodville by way of Galveston after the war. And so he kind of always felt a little bit ashamed of his background, relatively poor. And here he was exposed to the scions of very wealthy families. And he kind of had a resentment. In fact, that kind of carries through in his whole life. He chooses to make choices. I mean, he makes choices that are seemingly always settling for less than what he is. And how he ends up at this Grafton College in Huntsville, Texas, it kind of captures the essence of that too. Again, he wanted to go to the UVA, University of Virginia, and be in the faculty there. So there is that kind of a burning thing going on in him that is his issue to solve.
Mm-hmm. And his, I guess I'll say comadre, his friend Ellie, is something of a rescuer. And
exactly.
A caretaker.
And so she ends up in Huntsville by way of Asheville, North Carolina, where her family is from. And what we learn in the story is that she leaves on bad terms with her parents, running off with the boy, but that goes badly. And but her natural personality and the story tells that as a child, she was the rescuer of animals and brought them home. And in some ways, she sees Tom's problem and and sees the potential in him, and is driven to do something about pulling him out of that. Mm-hmm. But she's got her own problems and her own past to run from too.
Mm-hmm. And then Bob Vardis, the warrant officer who checks to make sure people don't get a medal they don't deserve and awards where they do. What's driving him?
Well, I was surprised to learn about how the Pentagon goes about dealing with claims for valor, right? Mm-hmm. And so Bob Vardis is spent his career, in effect, chasing the negative. He is the devil's advocate. His job is to disprove claims. So when you think about it, he's in the constant effort of finding the wrong answer. And that makes him very unpopular with, of course, anybody who, like a congressman, for example, who's got a constituent who has had a son who's died or didn't, but they're making a claim that he did some heroic thing, and his job is always to disprove it. And so he's a cynical guy. But after 30 years, it's kind of worn on him. And also, what happens to all of us as we age, of course, is cynicism rises as we see more and more of life. Mm-hmm. And to some extent, this rigidness about him, this mythology of constantly questioning, sets him up in a situation where he has a very difficult relationship with his own son. Mm-hmm. And the rigidity of it comes to play late in his life, just as he's about to retire. And what comes along is one of the last things he's asked to do is not so much verify a medal, but is find out who is this guy that they found in the Hurtgen forest near the Belgian border. Mm-hmm. And it is by coincidence that it connects them up with Tom and Ellie and Charlie Campbell.
Very interesting. Well, the reviewers say it's a thought-provoking novel that asks probing questions, and we've got something of a feel for the story. It's a good read from the part that I was able to get through this week. How many books is this for you?
This is my second
novel. Okay.
The first novel wrote 10 years ago, and it was the first sort of like trial effort to discover whether or not I could be a writer. Mm-hmm. But once I gave up work in earnest a couple of years ago, I decided that I was going to be a full-time novelist. And so this is the beginning of a series of works that I hope to work on in the next 5-10 years.
Great. Super. Thanks for being here, Michael. We're going to turn our attention now to Dr. Chip Dameron, who's a professor emeritus of English at this university. He's made only one grave mistake when he was administration at UTRGV. He hired me. Chip, welcome to the program.
Thank you. Thank you very much, John.
I got to look through the poetry. I like poetry. Chip is also a poet, and he has 2 books that we're going to talk about. I'm going to start with the China Sketchbook because I loved the ink sketches and the short poems. And I even asked you via email if you took a trip to China, and that inspired this. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I had an opportunity 6 or 7 years ago to make a trip over to China and spend almost a month traveling across and up and down and so forth. Really just a marvelous experience. And on that, while I was traveling, I made notes, I jotted things down, I took a lot of photographs, got a lot of memories, and I started writing some poems, some travel pieces, responding to things I was seeing and thinking about while I was on the trip. And then when I got back, I continued to do that. So really, I probably spent, probably over a year and a half or so, I worked on one poem or another. I ended up with 27 poems and decided that I'd like to see if I could, rather than have them be part of a larger collection, have them appear in a single publication. And so I was fortunate enough to have a Chicago publisher become enthused and agree to publish the collection. It came out last December. And so that's sort of how the project evolved.
Mm-hmm. Two views at the wall. Can I read one?
Sure.
Stone and brick, blood and chi. Changcheng snakes along the green peaks on its slow journey across another century, shedding its film of memory as tourists try to digitize what eluded a string of emperors and their Mongol predators. Shimmering in the morning sun, audacious and untranslatable. Below one tower, a young bride and her swirling silken train pose for a slew of photographs, the groom of an alabaster accessory. So you got to see the Great China Wall, and it inspired that.
I did, yeah. And of course, the China Wall is absolutely a memorable, incredible thing to see. And the poem grew out of the fact that while I was on the wall and taking it all in, I happened to look over and there was this couple. So it was I incorporated them, and I was struck by the long history of the wall, which goes back many hundreds of years, and then sort of the contrast in time of the wall, the history of China, and then this couple. Individual time. Here they're having their wedding photographs taken at the Great Wall, and they've got their own short history of time that they'll be living through. And so it was just an interesting contrast. And I think a lot of the poems in the collection grew out of contrasts that I observed of one kind or another.
Time is a theme in another one. To Du Fu, Happy 1300th. It must be interesting to think about one of the oldest cradles of civilization is China, and most of those things are over 1,000 years old that you get to see there. And
there's so many great Chinese writers. Of course, again, translating the Chinese characters is a challenge, and up until 100 years ago, there was probably little known in the West about many of these great writers, largely poets, but Du Fu is one of the writers that I've come to admire, and I've found that through the translations they're just eminently human and accessible. Their writing is philosophical, but it's also personal, and I found that with Du Fu and Li Bai, both of whom were great poets from the Tang period, which again 3 or 4 years ago was actually the 1300th anniversary of Du Fu's birth. And so again the impact of time and history and culture is something that's so impressionable when you're in China.
It's a beautiful work, but a very thin work. It's got some great sketches in it and some great poetry. But we have another book by Chip Dameron. It's called Drinking from the River. And it looks like he's selected poems from 40 years of being a writer.
Yes.
That are in there, yeah. have they been some of those been published in other works? Because I know you have other poetry books out.
Yes, in that collection, I've now with the Chinese sketches book, I've got 9 collections that I've written. Mm-hmm. This one was the previous one, so this was the 8th, and it came out in 2015. I'd gotten to a point where, I'd been, again, writing for 40 years, publishing in lots of small literary magazines and so forth, and then in books. And I thought, well, it would be, and I talked to my publisher, Wings Press out of San Antonio, and broached the idea of putting together a selected works and including some new poems. So there are, I think, about 40 new poems, but what I did is I went back through my previous collections and with the working with the publisher, pulled out what I thought were the most enduring of the poems that I've written, and so it's my biggest book, and does give a cross section of what I've done over a period of time.
Okay, I went to the new ones, and I really I looked at Drinking from the River, of course, but I also liked Remembering Vietnam. 40 years ago, I left good men and a good ship and a bad war in someone else's country, choosing words over weapons, books over battle stations. I still mourn for the dead and the maimed, and all those who live their losses each time they reach to touch a hand that is forever missing.
Yeah, I mean, we're still living with the consequences, the memories and consequences of the Vietnam War, both in this country and then, of course, the Vietnamese themselves. Mm-hmm. So,
difficult time it was. Mm-hmm. Our third guest is Wayne Moore. Dr. Moore has written a book that will surprise some, American Automobile Dashboards, 1899 to 1969. It's filled with colorful pictures and an interesting history. I didn't know that dashboards were a holdover from the horse-drawn carriage days to keep the stuff from splashing up on the riders.
Right.
But when we got to horseless carriages, they kept the dashboard.
Yes, the original function of a dashboard on a buggy was, as you said, to protect the occupants of the buggy from really manure and other things that the horses left behind, and the mud and all that. Mm-hmm. So that's why it was called a dashboard, things that were dashed up. Mm-hmm. And then when the horseless carriage came in, with the engines usually in the rear of the car, it served the same it served the same purpose. And then lots of changes happened between about 1899 and of course after World War II up through 1969. Mm-hmm.
I remember going through this and seeing that there was even a Sears car that you could buy on the catalog and assemble.
Yeah,
right?
It was called the Sears Motor Buggy. Mm-hmm. Not a very clever name, but pretty descriptive. And you could buy it through the Sears catalog. It was delivered by rail in a crate. It was delivered with a gallon of oil and directions for putting it together. It wasn't a very pretty dashboard or buggy for that matter, but functional.
I did, as I was going through this, I was reminiscing about classic cars. We had a conversation, and I said, if I were as rich as Jay Leno, I would have a collection of classic cars just like he did. And you got the chance to meet with Jay Leno, right?
Yeah, I wrote him a paper letter, the old-fashioned kind. Mm-hmm. And one Sunday afternoon, 2 or 3 weeks after I'd written the letter, I got a call. My wife took the call, and I was taking a bath or something, and she's screaming, "Wayne, it's Jay Leno." And I thought, yeah, right, this is one of the guys, either Mike or Chip here are calling me and telling me because they knew I'd written him a letter. But sure enough, Sunday afternoon, it's Jay on the phone, and so I asked him if I could come out and take some pictures of dashboards at his place, and he agreed. And later on, when I got out west after touring other museums out west, he spent a half day with me. I had the run of the place for the whole day, and it was great. And then after I published the book, or as I was publishing it, I sent him a draft copy and asked him to take a look at it. And again, one Sunday afternoon, he calls, and he's such a nice guy that he apologized for not having gotten back to me quick enough. And I told him that was okay. I didn't mind. But he said he liked the book. He was glad I think I have 3 of his cars in there. And I asked him if he said he liked it, he thought it was a great read. And I said, do you mind if I quote? And he said, no. He said, you can use my name however you want with the book. He said, just tell them what I said. And that's so I have a nice endorsement from Jay, and I've used it.
Well, what struck you most as you trace the history of it? What impressed you most in terms of the dashboards you got to take a look at and take photos of?
Well, that's hard to say. I think it was how closely dashboards mimicked the artistic and architectural designs of the time. In the late 30s, early 40s, before World War II, there was Streamline Modern. Early 30s, it was Art Deco. Mm-hmm. And then after the war, we had a little more Streamline Modern influences on dashboards. And then all the chrome and the excessive decoration and flashy stuff, jet-inspired things in the 50s and on up into the 60s. So I think it was the fact that the dashboards and car exteriors, because I do talk about automobile design in general in many places, as well as because all that fits in with dashboard design, mm-hmm. interior design, the influence of a closed car, and how early on closed cars were not very popular. People didn't want a car that was closed in, which seems strange to me. Mm-hmm. But I think it's the parallel of the design with the artistic designs, larger cultural and artistic designs. In fact, even in the 60s, the main theme of that period in terms of dashboard design and automobile design was a diversity, which fits with the times.
Mm-hmm. I do like to look at some of the different designs in here, but you've got some really great pictures, and I'm reminded of the things that I used to be impressed with in the past, like big white sidewall tires and the giant chrome bumpers. And you mentioned yourself that some of them were designed to look like a jet,
right?
So that you just think, oh, this thing really moves, right?
Right.
I had fun looking through all of your works, and I understand that y'all are going to be doing some book signing.
Yes, we're doing a book sign at the Brownsville Historical Association, September 14th. That starts at 6 p.m., I think. And all 3 of us will be there. We have prepared some little presentations, about 10 minutes apiece. It's going to be, I think, a nice event.
It's going to be at the museum, the Historical Association's museum on Madison Street. And we're looking forward to folks in the area coming out and joining us. We think of it as a book show rather than just a reading and signing. So mm-hmm. we hope that it's entertaining as well as informative.
Great.
It'll be the beginning, I think, of our tour. We've kind of put this show together as a means to both enjoy each other's company, but also get in contact with readers. So we're going to be scheduling these for the next year, actually, mm-hmm. going to different places throughout the state, and I've been trying to convince them that we need to go to Europe. Any reason at all to go to England would be fine.
Yeah, maybe China too.
Well, I can.
Why not?
I can put in my endorsement for Spain, Italy, and France. So.
Excellent. Yeah,
that's great. So right now the tour is primarily around, planned for around Texas. Are you going outside the great state of Texas at all?
Well, depending on how things go at the sort of the first phase of it, we might. But we're just going to sort of take it a step at a time. But we've got a number of locations in the valley, but also out of the valley, mm-hmm. and then we'll take it from there.
Super. Well, you've gotten yourselves great second careers, y'all, and I'm pleased to be part of this. I've never done an interview with 3 authors at the same time before, and I've never done it in the studio before. So this is a new experience for me as well. One last thing then about these authors is telling you where you can access the various books. Let's start with you, Michael.
Well, I started out being interested in the traditional approach to publishing, but discovered even 10 years ago that independent publishing was a way that you could get around the firewall to the publishing business. But things have changed. 10 years passed. Now books are published on demand because they're just as cheap ones as at 100,000. So, or by the time you take into account shipping and so forth. So my books and all of our books are available on Amazon and Barnes & Noble websites. Okay. And anyone can order a book and have it delivered to them in a few days or even 2 days. It is a game changer.
They're also available on our individual websites. My individual website is waynejmoore.com.
And mine is cdameron.com.
And mine is putegnat.com.
That's Putegnat.
There you go.
And Moore.
Thanks again, gentlemen. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good Books Radio is a program that is aired here in the Valley, but also in Brazos County and other places around the state, and in Thailand. So we are syndicated on various programs, and we are proud of what we do here, and I'm pleased to meet the distinguished gentlemen that I've known in their other careers with us today. I'm your host, Dr. John Cook. I remind you that if you don't hear our regularly scheduled program at its usual time, you can find us on YouTube at Good Books Radio, Strong and Cook. I'm your host, Dr. John Cook. Thanks for listening.